Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Joyce, and I'm the Content Director at F&P. Welcome to our very first webinar of 2021-23, not 22. Say hello to everyone in the chat box and tell us where you're from so we can interact a little bit. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today, I'm on the beautiful lands of the Gundungurra and Darug people. I welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we have with us today. Okay, as always, if you've been to our webinars before, you'll know that you'll get the slides and a link to the recording to this webinar in the next day or two. So you don't need to write down any notes if you don't want to. We'll have time for questions at the end, so please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them in time. So now to the main event. We're addressing a very hot topic and has been for some time, and that is the marketing and fundraising divide. To help breach that divide, we have the brilliant June Stewart with us today. She's a highly skilled fundraising strategist. She's a copywriting maestro, and she's the founder of June's Fundraising Letter. So let's get started with June. Welcome, June.
Thanks heaps for that, Claire. It's great to be here today. And thank you everyone for turning up today and giving me your time and attention. Now, I'm June. And I've been a fundraiser copywriter and a fundraising mentor, both officially and unofficially, for 16 years. My background is actually in journalism, PR, comms, and marketing, and I've done some stuff in IT as well. So yes, that means that I have worked with the dark side, and you guys can actually decide which side is the dark side. So now, what we're going to be covering today, I guess, is understanding why you have conflict between marketers and fundraisers, the reason why applying commercial marketing tactics to fundraising doesn't always work very well, the key difference between customers, service users, advocates and donors, storytelling, the tale of competing ethics and which side is right, branding, how fundraisers can offer positive input into a rebrand, and what is reasonable and unreasonable compromise between marketers and fundraisers. So what this session isn't, it's not necessarily about providing comprehensive solutions to these problems, but focuses on how to start discussions. The goal is to give you tools that can help you have some of the talks you actually need to have in order to be able to develop workable relationships. So just to begin with, I'd like to actually ask people if you can just put into the chat, in your charity, what conflicts do you struggle with between the marketers and the marketing, comms and brand people and the fundraisers? Just give me a yep, okay. Who gets to tell the stories? Yep, okay. We'll be talking a bit about that later on, or quite a lot actually. And finally, yes. How not to be cliche, different perspectives, focusing on stories of outcomes rather than emotion, restrictions on what we can say. Okay, different tone. Yes, brand versus fundraising message. We'll be talking a lot about that. Okay, yeah, being on brand, message of hope versus message of need. Yes, we'll be talking about that. Donor care and focus versus return on investment, fundraising messaging. All right, this is all really good. So I do understand all these conflicts. In 16 years of fundraising, I've seen or heard of them all and had lots of debates over them in one way or another. And over this time, this is what I've actually seen happening. And this graphic is the reason why I'm actually running this session today. All right. So what I've seen happening often is at some stage at the top of the cycle, we have a new fundraising director hired, and that person may hire other fundraisers as well into the organisation. And then what happens is that due to a lot of these issues which you guys have listed in the chat, the fundraisers will fight to use proven fundraising methods that they know will actually raise money. And then what happens is that you get resentment from the people in marcoms over fundraising techniques which they hate or really object to. And then some people will actually end up leaving over it. This process will, it takes months or sometimes even years. But then as the fundraisers are successful in raising more money, they rise in influence within the organisation. And then somewhere down the track, maybe a year or so later, as they after a year or so of enjoying the golden years of fundraising within an organisation, and they're hitting targets and breaking fundraising records and stuff like that, then they hire a new marketing director. And that new marketing director then hires other marketers. And then they fight against these proven fundraising methods. They might even introduce a new brand. And then there's resentment from fundraising staff as they watch their viable fundraising programs slowly being dismantled. And again, some of them will leave. All right. And then as the marketers have more success within the organisation, they are on the rise within the charity. And then after another year or two, or maybe 3 years, what happens then is like, oh, we need to get a new fundraising director because fundraising revenue has dropped off. And then the cycle starts all over again. Now, I've seen this happen within charities, not just once, but sometimes 2 or 3 times. And whether I get hired or not depends on whether fundraising is going through this part of the cycle or the second part of the cycle, because they tend to get me in when they're on ascendancy, and then they go with another contractor after when the marketers rise in influence. This is actually really, really, really wasteful. You spend all this time and energy fighting the same fights over and over again. Good staff are lost on both sides. And I really kind of think to myself, well, what if we actually took all that time and energy and we worked on deepening the internal connections between departments so we can run better integrated marketing and fundraising campaigns? Or I know that may sound like a bit of a dream. Or what if we took all that time, and what if we could spend all that time and energy instead of fighting over fundraising methods, we put that time and energy into actually making our appeal stronger, or on deepening donor connections. Now, the question then becomes, why do these conflicts actually occur? I believe that this is because marketing and fundraising often have fundamentally different goals. All right, so let's have a look at the differing goals and audiences of marketers and fundraisers. So for fundraisers, it's actually pretty simple. The goal is to raise as much money as possible, and their primary audience is donors. They may have related goals like deepening donor relationships or improving retention, but it still all leads to the primary goal of raising money. And so for marketers, they can have any or all of these goals within an organisation. They might want to raise brand awareness, in which case the audience may be the general public, or it may be the specific group that they're reaching with their services, and donors are only a small part of this audience. All right, it could be service users, the people who you're targeting your services at, in which case the audience is your end users. The marketers might have goals to measure satisfaction, in which case the audience is past users. They might have goals to change government policy or public policy in terms of advocacy, and so the audience there is government and bureaucrats. Or they might be wanting to get like-minded people on board, okay, in advocacy, and so the audience there is the public, and so on and so forth. Now, some of the biggest fights that we have, as some of you have actually mentioned as well in the chat, are over how we use language and storytelling. But when we're having these fights, and I think fundraisers also need to think of this as well. One question is to ask, when you're developing comms for all these different purposes and audiences, do you use the same voice for all of them? Do you speak to them all in the same way? The reality is that you actually don't, and it's not always even appropriate to do so. Okay, so if you're writing academic or research papers, you're expected to write in an academic style with sector jargon and terms that academics expect and understand. If you're developing media releases, you'll have more success if you write your releases the way journalists write their stories. If you're trying to advertise to or promote your services to end users, you speak to those end users again in a way that's actually relevant to them. And if you're writing a fundraising appeal, you need to use language that donors will respond to. All right, I think a lot of the fights that we have, if we can actually sit down and agree that we have different audiences, that's a first step to actually working together better. So let's look more closely at one example, raising brand awareness. So if the primary goal of marketers is to raise brand awareness, while fundraisers' primary goal is to raise money, as a result, the marketer's messaging tends towards the abstract and concepts. For example, concepts like giving hope or reaching potential or giving somebody a brighter future or giving care and compassion. While for fundraisers, messaging needs to be tangible and specific, like about giving food, education, medical equipment, helping people in poverty with wells or whatever it might be. Okay, also storytelling for marketers is about making the charity look good, while for fundraisers, storytelling is about connecting with the donor so they donate. Marketers want the corporate brand reflected in every communication. Well, for fundraisers, the corporate brand often gets in the way of personal, authentic communications. So both marketers and fundraisers in this case have specific needs, which means they each need to use language appropriate to that need and their audience. Now, in terms of money itself, so what I tend to find as well, and what I've seen, is that a lot of marketers often feel uncomfortable talking about and asking directly for money. Whereas fundraisers actually understand that talking about money is actually okay when you've built appropriate connections and relationships with donors. Okay, so marketers as well, I tend to find, don't want to ask donors to give because they believe asking is an imposition on donors. They feel embarrassed or like they're begging. Whereas fundraisers want to ask donors for funds in a way that helps them to express their identities and live out their values. So donating actually helps them to achieve their goals and become better people. Now, after years of having arguments over these types of things and the things that you guys have put into the chat box, the one thing that I have learned and discovered is that showing data does not always make people change their minds. So I have, it doesn't matter how well an appeal performs and how we can show how much more money we've raised. Showing this data does not make people change their minds in many cases. So for example, like I have a friend who believes the moon landing was faked. All right. And in the last few years, we've seen how different people have interpreted facts about COVID, vaccinations, and the government and other conspiracy theorists and the New World Order. We've seen how different people have interpreted the facts about those in different ways. And it doesn't actually matter what facts you show them, they persist in their beliefs. It's the same with fundraising. It doesn't matter how much data you show people about how your methods have raised more money or the positive donor feedback you get from some supporters. Some people just believe that certain fundraising techniques are wrong, and some people don't believe your data. So if this is the case, what do you actually do? I actually think that we need to start thinking about the marketing and fundraising relationship differently. So we need to actually look at this particular cycle and actually look at breaking the cycle of wastefulness. So for fundraisers, that doesn't mean your goal isn't still to raise funds, it is, and to increase donor retention, it is. But instead of aiming to win the fight all the time, the goal now is to actually break the wasteful cycle. I really encourage fundraisers to actually start having discussions rather than trying to win arguments. I've won lots of arguments over fundraising over the years, lots of them. Okay, and I have fundraising results that actually prove how our methods actually work. But this is not actually playing the long game. We need to actually, I think we actually need to do a better job of trying to actually work together with our marketing colleagues who do have a lot to offer our organisations. We need to understand that marketers may have multiple audiences to reach, and that donors aren't the only audience within the charity. I think both sides need to understand that fundraisers are experts on donors, but other marketing and comm staff are experts on the other audiences which they're trying to reach. Instead of going into discussions to prove that you're right, go into discussions asking how can we both get some of what we want. I'd encourage us all to actually lean into some discomfort. Maybe this is about facilitating a session to explore attitudes towards money. Maybe this is about facilitating a session about how we use emotion and what we are and aren't comfortable with and why that is. Maybe we have a session about problematic language and brainstorm acceptable alternatives. What can we say? Like so often we're told about what we're not allowed to say, but we're not actually given viable alternatives on what we can say. I'm inviting marketers now to actually start having these discussions. How can we actually work better together? How can we as fundraisers complement your work rather than being these little rogue outfits that you're trying to control all the time within the organisation? How can we actually do integrated campaigns better? I mean, it seems to me that a lot of advocacy and fundraising work overlaps, but often they are siloed within organisations. I mean, how can we actually work together so we can advocate for our cause and raise more money at the same time? Okay, there's got to be a better way than going through this cycle over and over again. Now, this brings me to the need to actually understand the difference between commercial marketing and fundraising. So in commercial marketing, the customer has a brand experience from the point of sale when they buy the product to actually using the product or service to the point where they hopefully experience customer satisfaction. And after sales support is part of that customer satisfaction experience too. So for example, if you buy a new iPhone, the act of using the iPhone hopefully is a good experience. Hopefully you have good feelings from using your iPhone. You're now cool because you have an iPhone. And you can ring people and you can chat to people, and as you get connected to the internet, that's all really great. And then there's all these apps you can play with. Now, in fundraising land, the donor actually has no experience of using a product or service because there is actually no product or service for them to interact with. The point of donation or making the donation itself is actually where they experience satisfaction. Making the donation is what brings the good feelings. So the only way you can really give the donor an ongoing experience is through thanking and reporting back on their donation. It's the difference here between asking people to buy something, which is of personal benefit, versus asking people to give something, which is heart-oriented. And so that brings me now to the fact that I think we actually need to change the way we talk about donors and giving. Part of the problem is that a lot of current fundraising practice is actually adapted from marketing practice. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's just the way it's occurred. So a lot of what we call relationship fundraising is actually rooted in marketing. Relationship fundraising actually came from the idea of relationship marketing. And we also talk about the customer experience and journeys, which we've translated into the donor experience and donor journeys. So we talk about the value exchange for customers, and then we question what is the value exchange for donors, which I think is odd in a way, because when you consider, that donating is like a heart-oriented action as opposed to a buying or consumption action. All right. So we use scales that measure customer satisfaction and trust, and we've adapted that to measure donor satisfaction, trust, and commitment. I'm not saying we should throw all that out, but the reality is that much of fundraising is actually based on the psychology of buying. versus the psychology of giving. And so ask yourself now, what do we actually even know about the psychology of giving? What do we actually know about the process which donors go through to actually donate? Who is actually studying this? And ask yourself, what would fundraising actually look like today if we had approached fundraising from the perspective of giving psychology from the beginning rather than buying psychology? All right, so that now brings me to customers, service users, advocates, volunteers, and donors, and the differences between them. So, question for you guys. Out of all these stakeholders that your charity may have, and I get that not everybody will have every single one of these, but to which ones does a psychology of buying or consuming actually apply? And to which ones do a psychology of giving apply? Just have a think about that for a moment. In the scheme of things, really, the psychology of buying applies to really applies to your top two, to these top two audiences, whereas the psychology of giving really applies to the bottom three. So let's have a look at this particular table. Okay, so as I've said before, a charity can have any or all these types of stakeholders. Not every charity will have all of them, but many will have more than one. Okay, so notice here that when donors take the action we want them to take, okay, they don't have a product to handle or a service to use or an experience to consume. Like, we have products in terms of a regular giving product or a bequest ask, but it's not something that donors can take home and go, ooh, here's my regular giving product, and I'm going to use it and enjoy it and show it off to all my friends. For them, the act of giving is the offering. Okay, so if we look here at the charitable motivation level column, you can see here, and this ties into the fact that their charitable motivation level is actually quite low. And for service users, okay, it doesn't exist, or at least not yet, okay, because the top two lines here show customers and service users, which are traditionally associated with commercial transactions. So here you can apply commercial strategies based on the psychology of buying and consuming, which are intrinsically about benefiting themselves. So yes, customers might help charity, but they wouldn't purchase or consume those. Customers might want to actually help charity, but they wouldn't purchase or consume these goods and services only to help charity. People don't take kids to the zoo to help charity, and they don't go to a certain hospital to become a grateful patient later on, and they don't buy concert tickets to a show they don't want to see. However, the bottom three here, advocates, volunteers, and donors, they involve asking people to take an action which doesn't actually directly benefit themselves. Now, working in different charities, I notice we almost never have conflicts over how we communicate with advocates and volunteers. Yet these people also operate on a psychology of giving as well. So why so much angst over how we communicate with donors? So earlier I said marketers and fundraisers have conflicts over different goals, but we also have conflicts because we feel bad about asking people to give money. We don't feel bad about asking people to give time or protest. We need to actually lean into questioning, why is this the case? Why do we feel bad about asking people to give money? I actually think this has to do with our attitudes towards money and our attitudes towards giving money to charity. I think it's actually important to actually start discussions internally about this. So I guess here are some possible questions to start some discussions. Like, do you feel icky or uncomfortable asking donors for money? If so, why is this the case? What personal beliefs or experiences do you have about money that affect the way you feel about fundraising? What do you think about the idea that people love actually giving to their favourite causes? I believe that we need to start addressing the root causes of why non-fundraisers are so resistant to the idea of asking for funds. If we're going to stop the wasteful fight cycle, we need to actually talk about these questions, and it will be confronting. This isn't about navel gazing, it's about addressing a core obstacle to fundraisers not being able to do their jobs. And it's also a big barrier to productive relationships between marketers and fundraisers. Okay, now I'm going to go on to storytelling. I'm not going to go through every bit of this chart. You guys can have a look at it in the slides later on, but just a couple of things I just want to question. So if we look at the fact that comms, advocacy, marketing, and fundraising have different goals. Okay, so, and look, you may wish to argue over those goals a little bit, but just work with me. As a general rule, these are the goals. So for marketing, obviously, to raise money. Oh, sorry, for fundraising, it's to raise money. For marketing, to raise the charity's profile and brand. For advocacy, it's to change systems. And for comms, often it's to give a voice to the beneficiary. Okay, now I wanted to have a look at the agent of change here. So when we're storytelling, or when comms staff are storytelling, they want to tell the story so that the participant or the beneficiary is the key driver of their own story and their life and future. When the advocacy staff are telling the story, they want to tell the story so that the participant is the key driver of systems change that transforms their own story, life, and future. Okay, and so when marketing want to tell the story, they want to tell the story so the charity is the key driver behind the participant's story, life, and future. And when fundraising wants to tell the story, they want to tell the story so the donor is the key driver behind the beneficiary's story, life, and future. And so when you actually look at these different viewpoints, ask yourselves, who is actually right? Who is actually right? Okay, if we look at language focus, for comms, the language focus is participant-focused language, which emphasizes what the participant has achieved. For advocacy, it's sector jargon and rights-based language, and a focus on not portraying the participant as a victim. From the marketing perspective, it's charity-centered language, emphasis on what we, the charity, have achieved. And for fundraisers, we want donor-inclusive language, which emphasizes what you, the donor, have achieved when telling the story. So who is right here? Who is right? Okay, should the fundraisers get the right to tell the marketing and comms team what language to use and vice versa? What I'm trying to get at here is that we need to actually be better at respecting different viewpoints and the different goals that our respective departments actually have. And now this then brings me to the clash of ethics. So on the one hand, you have the marketers and the comms people, their view, which is often backed up by program and executive staff, which says negative, need-oriented, donor-centered fundraising narratives are untrue, perpetuate stereotypes, encourage saviorism and strip beneficiaries of their agency and dignity. Versus the fundraisers' view, which is that hope-oriented narratives are untrue because in downplaying the need, you're leaving out a real part of the beneficiary's lived experience, which in its own way can also strip beneficiaries of their agency and perpetuate different stereotypes. So again, who is right? The fact is that they're both right. So the end result is the end result of fighting over this is a winner or a loser, depending on where you're up to in the wasteful fight cycle. So the question then becomes, who owns the story? All right, is it the beneficiary who owns the story? Okay, who gets the right to sign off on how they're portrayed? Is it the beneficiary? Is it the person who collects the story, who does the interview? Is it the department that commissioned it? Is it the communications copywriter? Is it the fundraising copywriter? Is it the charity itself? All right. So just some thoughts on this. The idea that the beneficiary or participant has a right to how their story is told is actually quite new. All right. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I used to be a journo. And as a journalist back in the day when I wrote stories, people interviewed didn't get the right to review their stories. Okay. As long as the journalist had done a fair job of being fair and accurate, and as long as it was factually accurate, it was okay. And the subject of whatever you wrote didn't get a say. Now, when I moved across and worked in comms, marketing and fundraising, this changed, okay? Because you have an agenda when you're working for a charity. This doesn't mean you lie necessarily, but you emphasize what is most likely to get you the result that you want, okay? That's marketing 101. All right. It always amuses me when people get on their moral high horse about truth and accuracy in storytelling, because the number of times I've written something based on direct quotes of what the CEO has said or some other senior exec, and then it's been changed either by the CEO or by the people responsible for branding. That's not fair and accurate representation either. Okay, so the question again is, who owns the story? It's only in recent times, with the rise of the internet, when anyone can actually be a publisher, that the question of who owns the story has become a bigger issue. But if you really want to give agency to the beneficiary, how do you actually do that? Is it actually better to train them to tell their own stories? And if that's the case, then what does that actually look like? If they get to make decisions about how their story is told, what will you do with the story they want to tell? Doesn't meet your fundraising needs or even your marketing needs? Do you only choose to use the stories that do? And if so, is that kind of curation just another way of controlling how you represent your beneficiaries? These are the questions that you need to wrestle with internally. Okay, so that brings me to the whole question of donor centricity. So how do you reconcile these competing interests of making the donor the hero, which is proven to raise more money, versus basically making anybody else besides the donor the hero, whether it's the beneficiary, the charity or workers, which risks raising less money? So how do you balance the move towards decolonising charity and fundraising against your responsibility to manage donor funds in the most efficient way possible? Or in other words, how can you tell donors that you're stewarding their gifts effectively if you're choosing not to use proven fundraising methods? All right, do we just continue to argue over these questions and continue the cycle of wastefulness? All right, so I believe that there are some possible solutions, even though these are very early days and still need to be tested. Now, what I'm talking about here comes from UK research conducted by Adrian Sargent and Jen Shank, a lot of their work, and a lot of fundraisers will be familiar with their work. And potential solutions include using collective donor identities and charity supporter identities. Okay, now I don't have the time to explain the whole research and theory behind this. Okay, but one way of using collective donor identity refers to making the donor part of a team with traits that they actually aspire to. So for many hospitals, for example, their donors are past grateful patients. Many of them talk about how wonderful the doctors and nurses were and how caring they were. So when we talk about them becoming a special part of the hospital's caring team of doctors and nurses, we ask them to be part of a team that they admire and aspire to be like. It's not donor-centered in the sense that you have made this happen. So it's not like your gift has made this happen, but it's donor-centered in the sense that you're moving the donor closer to how they would ideally like to be. So with this approach, there's a difference in why you've made the donor feel good. Instead of them feeling the joy of giving because they did something good, they feel the joy of giving because they're a good person. So instead of it being about their action as donor, as hero, it's about their sense of self as a caring member of the team. If you want more information about these approaches, then feel free to email me at the end, okay, because I'm actually looking for organisations who are willing to test these approaches now. All right, that's just one small example. I don't have time to go through, like I said, the whole theory behind that. Okay, so how brand experts and fundraisers can work together. Now, can this actually be done? So now, I do believe, despite all the arguments over this, I do believe that it's actually possible to develop brand guidelines that are workable for fundraisers, okay? But it does involve having some discussions, and it does involve some compromises on both sides, okay? So we need to be involving, if your organisation wants to go through a rebrand or a brand refresh, I mean, it sounds really obvious, but we need to be including the fundraisers in this discussion as well. And we need to actually have the discussions about what fundraisers need in terms of visual brand guidelines that actually helps them in their job and not hinders them, like whether it's to do with font sizes or appropriate colours that actually work for our older donors. And that's also about accessibility as well. So before you decide to make yellow a primary text color, have a really good think about what that's going to look like against a white background, and what that's going to mean for accessibility within your organization. Have discussions and wrestle with problematic phrasing, and have the discussions about how you can actually achieve authenticity. So here's an example of a lift piece from a standard direct mail pack. It's been designed, but it has an authentic feel because of the underlines, the notepaper lines, and the pictures that have been taped in. But how authentic would this look if you mandate a 2 centimetre by 3 centimetre logo in the upper right-hand corner, 0.7 millimetres from the edge? All right, you make it look corporate rather than raw, fresh, and authentic. Ask yourselves, how can the brand actually incorporate not just the psychology of buying, but also the psychology of giving? Okay, so while we understand that a brand doesn't just cater to the donor audience, but to multiple audiences, we do need to take into account the psychology of giving as well as the psychology of buying and consuming. All right. The challenge for us is to actually develop brand guidelines that communicate personal connection and authenticity, and not just abstract concepts. All right, so, and remember as well that your brand isn't just about language and visuals, but about experience. So every stakeholder within your organization experiences your brand differently. So service users will have a different brand experience of your charity to your advocates and your donors. So your donor isn't going to care about your logo or your brand colors if you get their name wrong, fail to acknowledge a gift, if they talk to a rude person when they ring up on the phone, or if they can't find the donation page on your website. All of those touches actually make up the brand experience. And I think if we can actually focus on brand experience sometimes a bit more perhaps than the visual and the language brand components of the brand, this is actually more productive. You can't enshrine brand experience into brand guidelines, but we need to be looking at the brand not just at what goes into the brand guidelines, but about the experience that all the different stakeholders are having. Okay. And finally, I think as fundraisers, as I mentioned earlier, we need to have a shift in goal from raising as much money as possible to actually breaking the wasteful fight cycle, okay? If our long-term goal as fundraisers is to make a lasting impact, yes, we can do this, through raising more dollars. And we can do this by building donor relationships. But if the fundraising program we build dwindles and dies after we're gone, or after we've moved on, and the donors we've loved into the charity leave as a result, how much of a long-term impact does that really actually have? It just means that instead of the next fundraising director coming in and building on the really great work that you've already done, they actually have to start all over again. So I used to think that unreasonable compromise was allowing changes to campaigns when we knew it would actually affect the performance of the campaign. I'm now asking whether we can actually compromise on that for the sake of developing workable relationships with our marketing colleagues. I now think unreasonable compromise is situations where the marketers absolutely will not budge on a single thing, and where there's no respect at all for fundraising expertise. In that case, you don't actually, the prospect of actually breaking the wasteful cycle, there's not really much hope of that. But I actually believe there are lots of marketers out there who would welcome being able to work on solutions and being able to collaborate with the fundraisers rather than fighting with them. So I hope I've given you all some frameworks and some points to have more productive discussions about resolving these conflicts. So I invite you to sign up to my newsletter or drop me an email. And if anybody is interested in exploring or testing the use of donor identities to increase funds raised or to boost donor well-being, and maybe also pioneer solutions to the marketing and fundraising message divide, then please email me. I would love to hear from you as well. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll hand over to Claire for Q&A.
Thank you so much, June. Some very interesting points to take into account. I hadn't thought about the whole psychology of giving versus psychology of buying. I did think it was interesting though, because some aspects of fundraisers, like especially if they're doing events, it might be a little bit of both with buying and giving, especially in peer-to-peer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that may definitely be the case. And I think if you go back to even, hang on a second, I'll just quickly, if we go back to here, so it may be the case that like perhaps in the case of peer-to-peer, I'm kind of thinking, would they almost be like advocates in a way, or a combination of advocates and maybe customers? I'm not sure, or maybe I need to come up with a different category. But the thing is like, if we take an example like service users, the psychology of giving doesn't apply when they're using the service, okay, but it may apply later on after they've gone on their youth camp, or they've gone to hospital, they've gotten the food from the food bank, and then they're back on their feet, and it's like, oh yeah, I actually really am grateful for what they did for me. And then they move into the psychology of giving. And so I think probably in the case that you're talking about, there may well be some kind of crossover like that, where a lot of people see they have a psychology of I think it's still rather a psychology of giving, but it's a psychology of supporting perhaps their friends. So it's not, they're not consuming as such, but they're still giving, but it's effective because they're giving to their friend. But it's not the same as giving directly to a charity.
Yeah, they're prompted by their friends, not as or even though they might like the cause, they're still they've got a different prompt to give.
Yeah.
Definitely. In terms of like working within brand guidelines, if anyone's got a question, please do pop them in the chat or the Q&A box. If we are looking at existing brand guidelines, and that came up a lot in the chat when people are asking about, it's like we can't go outside our brand guidelines. You may not have the opportunity to have a rebrand. That may not even be you might be just stuck there within these brand guidelines. And you talked about sessions and workshops where people discuss the language. Have you had any involvement in those, or have you had any experience of charities who are doing that?
Yeah, look, I've done it. I have done it a few times with different. We've had these discussions a few different times in, not necessarily in the context of a brand workshop, but potentially in the context of developing fundraising offers. But I think it's really about the fact that we need to actually start listening to each other better. And I think we also need to have a look at why there is so much resistance to what the fundraisers are actually trying to do. So, oh, sorry, I'm just looking at a question that came up in the webinar chat. I think in terms of facilitating those kinds of workshops, that's definitely something that I would be willing to get involved with if people wanted me to facilitate like an hour or 2 hour long workshop along those lines, because I think that there are solutions to these kinds of questions. And I think as well that it may be that fundraisers can't get everything that they want, but I think that when you actually look at the longer term context of being able to work more productively with the marketing team, and maybe you can run better integrated campaigns. And if that also means that after you leave, your work can continue rather than being dismantled, I think we need to look at the longer term impact of that, rather than having this really wasteful cycle of sometimes the marketers are winning and sometimes the fundraisers are winning, and in the meantime you fight over all the same things and then lose staff along the way. So yeah.
What about June? Krista brings up a really good point here, because what if they're merged? What if do you think marketing and fundraising function better as one team or separate? And I know a lot since my involvement with F&P that people have gone through this process of merging the teams or unmerging the teams. So what's your view on marketing and fundraising as a one function, two functions? Depends on the organization.
I think it actually depends on the organization. There will be some, and I don't think that I can strictly answer that question for across the board. I think that what you need to do is to look at your at what the marketing function is doing and what the fundraising function is doing, and see whether you actually have overlaps. And a lot of that also has to do with your audiences. So in some organizations, for example, like say let's take a hospital. Okay, so the marketing team in the hospital, they are promoting oh no, actually let's take a food bank. I think that's easier. So the marketing team in the food bank is trying to promote the food bank to people in need, basically, whereas the fundraisers are trying to raise funds from donors so that the food bank can run. And those are actually quite two separate and distinct audiences, in which case the marketing and the fundraising team might work better separately. However, if you as part of the marketing team, you have a function where you are doing advocacy and trying to change, either trying to get people on board and sign petitions or whatever, or trying to lobby the government to change policies that are keeping people in poverty so they can't buy food. That to me seems to be a good crossover. Could be, in some cases, be a good crossover with fundraising, where some of your audiences may overlap, in which case the fundraising and the marketing team could potentially be one function. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Rachel at WWF Australia says, I love this difference in storytelling, light bulb moment. Yay. One of the biggest challenges we have, and this is related to what you're just saying, is we have with our non-financial supporter audiences, people who have raised their hand or expressed some interest but not yet given. So they are potential advocacy and fundraising prospects. And unfortunately, they get mixed messages about both. Any guidance on how to help view and manage this audience? So I think maybe you answered a little bit about this, but do you have any more?
Okay. Nice. I think the best way to deal with that, honestly, is actually just to ask them. like do some kind of survey and ask them, are you interested in supporting WWF financially? You know, whether whether you ask, you don't necessarily have to ask them about your different fundraising products at that stage, but ask them whether or not they're or are they interested in joining your advocacy campaigns on X, Y, and Z, and give them options to tick. And then that way, I mean, you won't cover all of them, but at least you get a bit of an idea. And that also doesn't preclude you from occasionally just testing the waters. And if you, I don't necessarily think you should send them every fundraising campaign, but if you have a big one where you've got some extra budget, you can send them, they can be a segment of your appeal, and you just watch how they perform. If you're getting a good response rate from them, then continue sending them appeals like that. If you're barely covering your costs of mailing them, then maybe they're not good prospects. So I think it's about, you need to do the work of actually qualifying them both as advocacy and fundraising prospects. It's not about who should have the rights to actually communicate with these people. It's about actually finding out what they want, because some of them won't want to donate, but they do want to advocate, and vice versa.
Yeah. And they might not want to feel bad about the fact that they don't want to donate, or
that's right,
the capacity to. Cameron asks, thanks so much, June, really interesting stuff. I'm curious where the line can be drawn though. Obviously, each team serves a very important purpose, but isn't some amount of conflict inevitable to ensure that one strong department head with a specific vision for donor engagement doesn't completely overwhelm the way an organisation communicates to its supporters?
Yes, there is going to be conflict. And look, despite the fact that I do want fundraisers and marketers to be working better together, look, I have seen toxic situations where it's just not going to be possible. And there is going to be, look, there was a point as well in which I actually thought having that conflict was a healthy thing. And in some cases, I think it can be a healthy thing. But I think when I look at the wasteful cycle, I now actually, taking a longer term view, I actually think it's more problematic than positive. So
yeah, I think, I mean, well, look, you have a comms and a journalism background, and in our industry, media industry, it's called church versus state. So it's the creative and the editorial versus the sales and so you have to, and it always works best if you can understand each other. I mean, it's not rocket science, I guess, is it? Ben asks, how do you manage scheduling of messages to supporters, comms that ask supporters to go deeper versus give more?
Look, honestly, I think this this has to be done. I do think you need to have a combination of both. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, how often can you actually communicate with a donor, or how often can you actually even with EDMs, how often can you email a donor? Well, in reality, you could actually, in theory, and please don't freak out when I say this, in theory, you could actually email a donor every day, or a supporter every day, if you have relevant communications to share with them. Now, that doesn't mean that I think you should be asking them for money every day. I don't. And in fact, I don't think that that's a good approach. But the thing is that, we get all these complaints about, we only ever send our donors asks for money, and we don't send them anything else. And it's like, well, yeah, I agree. We shouldn't just send them asks for money. But the reality of most charities is that they don't have the resources to develop the quality communications that you actually need in between all the fundraising asks. So what I would actually suggest to you is that you actually sit down and map out your calendar for the year and go, okay, these are the times when we're running our campaign, so these have to be fundraising asks. But in between, we want to complement this campaign. We want to complement this campaign with a lead up of messages around this particular issue, which is related to that campaign. And even within a fundraising campaign itself, if we do, like with a lot of my clients, we will do anywhere from 3 to 8 emails for a fundraising appeal, depending on what type of appeal it is. But if I'm doing 8 EDMs, not every single one of those is an ask. Okay, sometimes you're sharing video content, sometimes you might be sharing images, sometimes you might share some general information about the issue. You might have a softer ask, and then but out of 8 emails, maybe three of them have a really hardcore, we really need you to donate now kind of thing. So I definitely think that there is space for go deeper versus give more, but you do need to plan your calendar very carefully, and you need to actually make sure that you're giving your donors content which is actually relevant to them in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that donors don't mind. Like, I don't mind that I'm getting lots of emails about the earthquake at the moment. That's like important things that you need to know. So yeah, as long as it's relevant. Sam says this is great to have a holistic view of audience needs. It makes me wonder why overall organizational communication planning doesn't take in all these inputs and take a holistic org view. But yeah, that has to come from leadership and people communicating to leadership and leadership acting upon it. But yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, and I think as well, sometimes people don't actually, I think a lot of senior staff don't actually understand the conflicts as well, and they don't necessarily understand, the needs of fundraisers. Like the fundraisers aren't just arguing because they want something a certain way, but it's because there is actually proven testing and research which actually backs up what they're saying. And that also brings me to somebody else's question, which I saw here. I'm curious if there's any testing around short versus long DM formats.
Yeah.
And okay, so yes, there is. So if you talk to pretty much any direct mail consultant or fundraiser, most of them have done testing, which actually shows that in most cases, long letters outperform short letters. Now, from my own experience, I've always had one of two results when I've tested long versus short direct mail. Either the long letter has performed better than the short letter, or the result has been inconclusive. I've never actually had a short letter outperform a long letter. The situation is a little bit different for EDMs. For email, generally speaking, in most cases, long EDMs, probably about 7 times out of 10, 2/3 of the time, long EDMs outperform short EDMs, but it's not as clear cut, okay? Because I have done testing which has shown short emails outperform long emails. But in general, the short emails that outperform the long ones are the ones where it's really, really, really close to the appeal deadline. And also where the fundraising offer is really simple to understand. Okay, so if you're from an organization where the offer is complicated or the issue is complicated or whatever the case might be, then most likely a long EDM will serve you better. The only other exception as well is in the case of an emergency where the media has done all the work for you. So for example, with the current earthquake, I'm pretty certain, look, I couldn't prove it conclusively, but it's highly likely, it's possible that a shorter email would do better than a longer email simply because everyone is seeing the earthquake in the media. So they've done all the work for you. You don't need to explain to them what the problem is. They already know because they're hearing about it all the time.
Okay, great. Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, June. That was great. And as Inga says, so much to consider in this age-old battle. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing everything and your input. It's very interesting, the psychology of giving and buying and how you separate out all those different stakeholders. So thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you at our next webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.